Welcome to the NSX Advanced Load Balancer Operation Workshop video series. My name is Sean, and today we're going to continue talking about understanding NSX ALB virtual services. The topics in today's video will be Layer 4 DNS virtual services, as well as Layer 4 DNS application profiles. We covered some application profiles in the earlier videos, but we didn't do DNS or Layer 4. And we'll also touch on TCP and UDP profiles. So let's jump right into the demo. So on my controller, I'm going to first jump to templates, and I want to talk about the TCP and UDP profiles first. So we have a bunch of profiles that are packaged with the system. You can see they're named to be somewhat descriptive, so to give you a rough idea on what the configuration properties under them are. So if I go create, we see there's only actually 4 different types. We can start off with the TCP proxy because that's the one it defaults when you first create it. So of course, like everything we've seen so far, you need to create a name. So if we look at the TCP proxy settings, we have auto learn as well as custom. So auto learn, it's as it sounds. We'll auto learn the proxy settings when we do our connection. Or there's custom. So for custom, we can do various different things. Some of these might look familiar, some of them might be new. If you've dealt with networking devices and deep dive into server configuration, some of these will look very familiar. So we can control the timeout. For the idle connections, we can have a TCP keep alive, or we can age out the idle connections. And then we have durations that we can set based on this. We have an ignore time wait, so this is for when we'll accept a sync connection for 4-tuple. We can leave it at 2000 or just ignore it. We won't have a time wait setting. We can control the retransmission behavior, so max retransmissions and max SYN retransmissions. We have our receive window that we can configure. We can use interface MTU, or we customize our own. And then we have some QoS properties we can configure. And then at the bottom here, we have Nagel's algorithm. So as you see, it's disabled by default, but you can enable it. So these are different TCP proxy settings you can configure. Now for UDP proxy, there's not as many. You have your session idle timeout. Now what we mean when we say TCP proxy or UDP proxy is when the connection is coming into the load balancer, we're going to proxy those connections. So it'll terminate at the load balancer, it'll terminate at the service engine, and then we'll start a new connection to the backend server. Now that's important to know when we look at these fast path types. So we have TCP fast path and UDP fast path. Now what this means is the connection will come to the load balancer, to the service engine like it normally does, but we're not going to proxy that connection. We're going to forward that client connection onto the backend server. And the only thing we're going to do is rewrite the source IP to be the service engine IP, just so that server traffic response comes back to the service engine and reaches to the client. So we have a symmetric path. UDP fast path, same concept, exact same concept. So if we want to enable DSR, which is direct server return, we can do this, and we can select which type. I recommend reading more on the KB as we go through a couple different use cases and explain the scenarios further. But the main purpose of this is so when the connection comes into that server, the backend server will send directly to the client. So it won't be going back through the load balancer. It'll just send directly to the client. And then we have enable SYN protection. So let's look at what this does. When enabled, AVI will complete the 3-way handshake with the client before forwarding any packets to the server. This will protect the server from SYN floods and half-open SYN connections. So it looks like we'll do the 3-way handshake for that server, and then further connections are to that backend server. And session idle timeout. We'll set as timeout for when sessions become idle. And UDP fastpath, similarly we have our DSR. And then we have the UDP fastpath settings. NAT client IP address, SNAT. So this will disable SNAT when sending to the backend servers. Now it's a UDP connection, so maybe we don't expect a response. And then per packet load balancing, let's see what this guy is. When enabled, every UDP packet is considered a new transaction and may be load balanced to a different server. Okay, so we'll load balance to a different server for every new connection. That's pretty clear. When disabled, packets from the same client, source IP, and port will be sent to the same server. So we'll send to the same server based on IP and port. Okay, pretty clear. And we have our session idle timeout as well. So that's the different types we have here. And we'll go through some use cases shortly on how we're going to configure some of these. So let's close out of this. Now let's look at some more application profile types. So we'll click create. And we talked about HTTP for the last two videos, but we have other application profiles we can touch on. So let's first look at DNS. So DNS, we have quite a few settings. We can set the number of IPs that we're going to return for a DNS response. So we get a query and we send a number of answers. And the default is set to 1. So 1 answer. And we have our negative TTL, negative time to live. Let's take a look. Specifies the TTL value in seconds for SOA, start of authority, corresponding to an authoritative domain owned by this DNS virtual service. So it's the record's minimum TTL served by the DNS virtual service. But we also have this TTL, which is the TTL of any responses coming from this DNS virtual service. So this is the one that will come for any A records come in, we'll have a TTL of 30 seconds. So options for DNS query processing. So if there's a query we don't understand or we don't have a response for, we'll drop unhandled, or we can respond to unhandled DNS requests. And we'll just respond as we don't have that record. And if we're not using quad A records, we could respond with empty responses, or if we just disable this, we'll respond based on these options. We can set a subnet prefix for any records that come in without a eDNS extension. And then we can also process eDNS extensions, so when we're looking to the logs, we can see this extension. We can specify rate limiters for anything coming in for DNS records. And there's more rate limiters. Just like the HTTPS, there's multiple places to set up a rate limiter. We can preserve client IP. So we saw that before. We enable preserve client IP, and it would keep that client IP when it sends to a pool or anywhere else. And then we can specify valid subdomains. So subdomains we deem valid, subdomains that we will process. And here we can specify the authoritative domain names and a default admin email. We can add more if we have more, or just add the one. So that's the DNS application profile. Next, let's look at layer 4. So layer 4, we have our name, we have TCP settings, enable proxy protocol. So since it's layer 4, we can't do an X forwarded for insert, but we can do this enable proxy protocol. And when we click this, we can either have this proxy protocol inserted in the TCP for version 1, which is clear text, or version 2, which will have the client IP as in binary format. And then the backend servers just need to know how to decrypt that, just how to understand it. We have a rate limiter, and then preserve client IP. Not as many settings. Layer 4 SSL TLS, very similar to the layer 4 protocol. The only difference, when we enable this, we can actually specify an SSL cert on the virtual service, and I'll show that shortly. And this will basically allow us to do a termination on that virtual service, but only for layer 4, so we won't read into the layer 7 content of that packet. And then we have SIP. And here we only have a transaction timeout. So if you're using a SIP protocol, you can specify your transaction timeout. And for your virtual service, just make sure you specify that it's a SIP application profile. And then syslog. So not too many settings here. The main thing to know about this application profile is when it's enabled on the virtual service, it will understand that this is a syslog virtual service. So it can understand the traffic a little better. Great. So we touched on TCP UDP. We touched on the extra application profiles we have available to us. Let's look at a virtual service that's actually already configured, and that being our DNS virtual service. So if I click on this, so let's look at the configuration of this DNS virtual service. Now, looking at this, it looks very familiar. It looks just like the other applications we've built in the past. We're using the system DNS application profile, but we're using a system UDP per packet UDP profile. Now, why is it per packet? What's different? Well, if we click on edit, we can see the main difference is per packet load balancing is enabled. And it being enabled means any client connection is going to go to a different server. Now it's a UDP connection and it's going to backend DNS servers. So if those DNS servers all have the same A records, all have the same database, we're hoping that no matter which DNS server we hit, we'll get a response for the query that's made. So that's why per packet's enabled. Scrolling down a little more. So this is the default TCP UDP profile that's enabled. And why is that important? Because if we look at the service ports, we actually have 2 ports enabled, 53, and there's this override TCP UDP. And then we have 53 again with it override TCP UDP enabled, but we're using the system TCP proxy instead of the UDP profile. So this is a way to leverage a TCP and a UDP profile under one virtual service. So basically this virtual service, this IP, will respond to TCP queries for DNS and UDP queries for DNS. And this is how you enable it. So in short, up here would say switch to advanced. You'd switch it to advanced, and you can now edit the override TCP UDP. We also have a pool for this DNS virtual service. Now, what the pool does for a DNS virtual service, if this virtual service doesn't have the A record for a particular query, we'll forward it on to the pool members behind this DNS virtual service. So if your DNS virtual service is in front of other DNS servers, maybe this is the more authoritative DNS and you want to forward on to further subdomains, well, you can add those DNS servers as pool members. So let's start looking through the other advanced features. So policies, we have particular DNS policies. Now, since we have a DNS application profile, that means we can understand DNS traffic. We can read into the DNS packets coming in. So we can actually configure DNS policies. And this will be touched on in a later video series. We can configure analytics. So just like before, we could have non-significant logs enabled, and this would just be successful queries to the DNS server. Advanced, more into the configuration, but it looks very similar to what we saw when we did the virtual service configuration for layer 7 and basic. And then static DNS records. So we can actually create DNS records. And these are all the types we can create. And when a query comes to this DNS virtual service, it'll give the response based on what we create. But on top of this, since I'm using a DNS profile, if I click on DNS records, I'm auto-populating A records based on virtual services I create for this DNS virtual service. So this is how when I go to the websites of the applications I've already created, I'm actually resolving them against this DNS virtual service. So if I look at the logs, and let's look at the past logs, and we'll go to non-significant, and we see that my DNS virtual service is responding to A records. Now, what is the A record for? Heavy Networks Region 01 corp.local. And let's see if we can find that down here. Heavy Networks Region 01 corp.local. And then the response is this record. And we have that TTL of 30 because that's the default TTL that we have in the DNS application profile. And we can see many other settings here. So these become more important when you look at GSLB because you'll have a DNS virtual service for GSLB. So you can see which A record this DNS virtual service responds for that GSLB site, for that GSLB infrastructure. Great. So the last thing I want to look at is our layer 4 configuration of a virtual service. So let's go to advanced settings. I can set, say, layer 4 app. And we're going to set, we'll first look at a layer 4 application. So layer 4 application, there's not too much different here. I mean, it's going to be a layer 4 application, whether it's HTTP and you just don't want the traffic to be inspected at all, and you just have it at system layer 4. Maybe you're doing SSL termination on the web servers instead. So you'll just have that connection pass through. But keep in mind, if you want the load balancer to terminate the connection, you can have a TCP proxy enabled, or switch it to fastpath, where the connection will actually terminate on that backend server and will only change the IP of the source address so that there's a symmetric path for that traffic. So if I was to click next, there wouldn't be much extra configuration required. The other thing we can do is enable SSL application. So this is the layer 4 application profile with SSL. Now what's different when we enable this one? We can now specify SSL settings because we're going to have that TLS communication to terminate the SSL connection on the front end. So let's configure this. So we'll call it layer 4 app. Let's call it layer 4 secure app. I'm just going to copy paste this just so I don't forget it. We'll configure everything else the same. So layer 4 secure app, everything looks good. We have to configure a pool. So I'll try to remember a pool address or a pool port. So let's do this. Add servers. We'll jump back here. 300. Let's do 30080. Next, save. And we'll just save this configuration. So one thing with the layer 4 application, you don't have as much policy configuration. You only have network security and data scripts. So there will be a conversation about data scripts in modifying application behavior. But layer 4 is more restrictive. So you can't look into the packet as much as you can with a layer 7 application profile. So let's go next. And again, these settings are very familiar. There's nothing different here. So we'll save this configuration. Virtual service should come up and we'll test it. So let's test HTTPS layer 4 secure app region 01a.corp.local. Here we go. And the application works. So let's verify that I'm actually hitting that application. Yep, and looks good. And like I said, it's a layer 4 application, so there's not as many logs. We will be going through logs a lot more in troubleshooting, in modifying application behavior. This is just a rough overview. So we see that the SSL offload is happening because we're using an SSL version and an RSA certificate type. So this confirms that we are doing that SSL offload operation. That covers everything for this video. I hope this information was valuable, and if you want to have a play for yourself, definitely check out our hands-on labs. It has the same lab environment I've been using, and I've just been creating more virtual services as we get deeper in this video series. So thank you for joining me, and stay tuned for more videos.